Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dermveda's webinar. And it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Raja Sivamani to our Introduction to Sun Protection. And I do want to confirm that you all can see our screen and hear us okay. So if you have any trouble hearing us or seeing our slides, let us know in the chat window on the side. And please also go ahead and feel free to introduce yourselves if you want to share where you're from, maybe what interested you about this topic today. The goal really is to ensure that we help you prepare for a safe and fun summer. And so we've invited one of our advisory board members to share some advice and some tips on an integrative approach to sun protection. So to begin, I want to start with an introduction to Dermveda and more about what we do. So Dermveda is a website that is dedicated to skin health education, and our goal really is to provide trusted, credible information about skin health and skin care. We were founded by dermatologists, and we're also run by alternative medical practitioners. So here's how it works at Dermveda. If you go to dermveda.com, you can actually find your unique skin type. So we have a free quiz that allows you to profile to one of 14 skin types. And then from there, you can actually learn about different content areas that match your skin type, so you can find really relevant information. Or let's say something new pops up that you want to learn more about, you can input that information into our skin symptom educator and find possible causes to that concern that you're having. And then finally, we do offer classes as well as a product platform that analyzes ingredients and products. And we've actually been able to match those ingredients to skin types. So it'll help inform the decisions you make about whether it's a beauty or makeup product or a sunscreen or a moisturizer, whatever that sun care might be or skincare might be. And then with regards to content, here's a snapshot. So for example, these are some of our articles related to sun protection that are coming up. And all of this content is free to the general public. So we hope you'll take full advantage of that. And without further ado, I'll let Dr. Raja Sivamani kick off our sun protection class. He is on our advisory board. He's a board certified dermatologist, as well as an assistant professor at University of California, Davis. He also studied Ayurveda, traditional Indian medicine, and brings both of those perspectives, the Eastern and Western perspective, to his practice in dermatology. So it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Raja Sivamani.
Thank you, Vanita. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about sun protection. It's an area that I'm very passionate about. This is an exciting topic for me. Sun protection also, as we go into the summer months right now, this is a fun topic because I really like to figure out how we can think about sun protection, sunlight, and just realize that there's a lot of interplay between the good and the bad of sunlight. Sun is so good for us in so many ways, and also we have to be very careful about how we protect ourselves. What I'm hoping to do in this introduction is to just give you all a little bit of a window into what are some of the tips and the tricks that you might not be able to read about so easy, but might make a big difference when you're thinking about sun protection and how to make the best of your sun safety habits. So to start it off, one of the things that I think would be really nice to talk about is an overview that kind of gives us a snapshot of what we're going to be talking about for today. So, looking at the topic slide, one of the things that what I'd like to do is, and if we can get to the next slide. So, the topics for today, really we're going to be focused on different aspects of sunlight and ultraviolet light. And one of the things will be to start with just an overview of what's in sunlight, what's in ultraviolet light. And then we'll talk a little bit about sunscreens and about protective clothing, how you might approach protective clothing, and then what are the risks that come with tanning, but are there ways to approach tanning that might be safer? And what we'll do today is I'll do a little bit of we'll go into the details a little bit, but then we're going to go into much more detail in our next webinar where we can really focus on some of these tips and tricks. So let's get started with sunlight. So in sunlight, sunlight has multiple different forms of ultraviolet light that, that make it up. And ultraviolet light, by and large, is what tends to damage our skin the most. And so when we think about ultraviolet light, there are three different types of ultraviolet light. There's ultraviolet A, there's B, and C. And now what you might not realize is C is essentially protected. We are protected from it being exposed to ultraviolet C because our ozone layer absorbs all of it. And so it doesn't really get to the surface of the earth. So primarily what we worry about is ultraviolet A and B. It turns out ultraviolet B is stronger, meaning it can cause more mutations and it's more damaging to the skin, but it doesn't go in as deep. And then ultraviolet A is also damaging. It's not as damaging as ultraviolet B, but that can go in a little bit more deeply into the skin and lead to things like aging, collagen breakdown, wrinkles. When you see people that get leathery skin, that's also part of it. And so when you're thinking about sun protection and how to really maximize your sun protection, you want to look at ways to protect against both ultraviolet A and ultraviolet B. So let's get into a little bit more of the details of what that actually means. So when we think about the harmful effects of sunlight, there's multiple ways that sunlight can affect our skin. There are primarily, the way this happens is the damage occurs through the formation of these very reactive chemicals known as free radicals, superoxides, and singlet oxygen. And what happens is when sunlight, especially ultraviolet light, hits the skin, these very reactive chemicals are formed. And what they do is they try to grab onto whatever is close by. And by doing that, they end up damaging the surrounding cells, the surrounding cell membranes. They can cause mutation to DNA. They can break down the normal structure of the skin. And so it can affect all levels of the skin. And what we're showing in this schematic here is if you look at the left, you can see ultraviolet A penetrates all the way down deep, and ultraviolet B tends to stay a little bit more superficial. But the point is that you're damaging proteins, you're damaging very important structural proteins like collagen and elastin, and you're affecting all levels of the skin. And so when we think about when we think about protecting from sunlight, you want to, the important thing to realize is it's not just blocking UVA and blocking UVB, but what do we have in our stores, in our natural repair abilities to counteract some of these very reactive molecules. So that's something that we'll get into more details about when we go into the full webinar. But I wanted to give an introduction to the kind of things that ultraviolet A and ultraviolet B can do to the skin. So now why don't we talk a little bit about sunscreens? And so what we're gonna do is really think about what are the different kind of sunscreens that are out there, and what do they essentially do when we think about protecting us from damage. So they protect us against sunburns, they protect us against sun damage in general, and they protect the skin from aging, and they protect from the development of skin cancers. And all of them are very important. And then, you know, it's hard to figure out how do you choose the right sunscreen. And this is a question that I get from patients all the time. You know, what is the best way to choose a sunscreen? Is it based on SPF? You know, SPF's almost like a badge that people use now. You know, it used to be SPF 4s way back when, then it went to 15, then 30. And now it's really ballooned 50, 70, 100 plus. The new regulations are going to cap it at 50, and anything above 50 is going to be called 50 plus. And so that's one approach to thinking about sunscreens. But globally, when you really think about it, the major question that we want to ask, and that's what we've got posed in the next slide here, is how do people choose their sunscreens? What is it about the sunscreens that helps them figure out that it's the right sunscreen for them? And so when we're thinking about sunscreens, it's really important to really understand what is SPF, because that's really how most people choose sunscreens. Multiple studies have shown that that is the #1 way that people choose sunscreen. So why don't we get into the definition of what SPF actually means? So what SPF means is sun protection factor. And you might think, oh, if it's sun protection factor, that means it blocks all of the harmful effects of sunlight. And when you look at the definition, without getting into the weeds too much here, really what it is in a very simplified way, it's the ratio of how much sunlight does it take to cause your skin to become red when you wear sunscreen, and then you compare that to when you don't have anything protecting the skin. So for example, if it takes someone 5 minutes to burn, or not even burn, but just to turn red, and then if they put the sunscreen on and now it took them 10 minutes before they turned red, basically that's 10 divided by 5, that means you have an SPF of 2. So similarly speaking, if someone if it only took them a minute to burn, then if something had an SPF of 2, well, now it'll take 2 minutes before, sorry, not burn, before you turn red, then you'll start to turn red within 2 minutes. But what's really important is that when you look at UVA and UVB, it's UVB, and the clever little mnemonic that I was taught was that B is for burning and A is for aging. Now, of course, some portions of UVA and a lot of UVB can do both aging and burning. But by and large, UVB is what leads to redness in the skin and causes sunburning. And so SPF really measures UVB exposure and UVB protection more than UVA. So it does not represent total sun protection. And I think that's really important to realize. So the next thing that I'd like to really talk about, and this is a fun little graph where we really think about how much UVB are we truly blocking when we talk about SPF. And on this graph, if you look along the bottom, basically the bottom axis is looking at SPF as it increases from 0, 20, 40, 60. And then on the other axis, we're looking at what % of sunburn causing ultraviolet light, which would be UVB primarily, are we blocking? And so you can see here that when you have something that hasn't, and you can look at this nice little chart that's been embedded, if you have an SPF of 2, that means you're blocking 50% of ultraviolet B light. But then as you start moving up, you start to see that once you get to SPF 10, you've blocked 90%. You get up to SPF 30, you've blocked 96.7%. And after that, there's a lot of diminishing returns. And what I mean is that just boosting the SPF number doesn't mean you get that much more protection. And so you can see that when you go from 30 to 50, you're adding 1.3 extra % of blockade. And if you go all the way up to 100, you get to 99%. So, you know, one of the things that you would think SPF means is that, oh, you know, if I have an SPF 30, and then if I buy like an SPF 100, the SPF 100 would be 3 times more protective. And actually, that's not true at all. What you get is about 2 to 3 extra % of blocking ultraviolet B. And so that's why a lot of the recommendations right now are that people get SPF 30, and after that, you really want to look at other factors that are very important. So when we think about other factors, well, why don't we discuss what are the other factors? So some of the factors that are really important in controlling how well your sunscreen behaves is a few things. One is how thickly do you put on the sunscreen? How thick is it when you put it on? What are the ingredients that you're using? So there are multiple different ingredients that can be involved in sunscreen, and a couple examples include zinc oxide or titanium dioxide, but there's also a lot of chemical blockers that can be used, and a couple examples are avobenzone, octocrylene, and what we'll do is when we go through the full webinar, I'll give you a good snapshot so you can understand what the differences are between the different ingredients. And then we also have to remember that the environment matters a lot. So if you've put on sunscreen and you're sitting and you know, you're just in the shade or you're not sweating too much, that sunscreen's probably going to stay in place. But if you're sweating quite a bit, some sunscreens tend to run. Or if you get into water, say if you're in a pool and moving around a lot, then that sunscreen might come off a little bit more easily. or if you're on the beach and playing in the sand and you're running into crashing waves, then that sunscreen might come off more easily. So there's a few things that affect how well the sunscreen stays on. And we'll go over some of those factors too. And an important tidbit is that when sunscreens are tested, they're not tested in chlorinated water, or they're not tested in salt water. So it's important to remember that some of the testing that's done may not necessarily fully reflect how you use the sunscreens. So we'll talk about what are some of the things that you can do to boost how well the sunscreen works. And then finally, you have a skin anatomy. So it turns out your skin has these fine ridges. Your skin is not perfectly flat. It has these fine, beautiful ridges that go up and down on your skin just naturally. And so when you put sunscreen on, it will naturally settle. And when it settles, what will happen is that there'll be portions of the skin that aren't fully protected anymore. And so that's why one of the recommendations is that you put the sunscreen on, and then you wait about 10 to 15 minutes, and that allows some of that sunscreen to settle, and then you put on a second coat. And that's how you can boost how well your sunscreen will act. And one of the benefits of putting on 2 coats is that now you will also increase the thickness of the sunscreen that you're putting on, because the thicker that you put on the sunscreen, the more protective it's going to be. So one of the things I thought we could talk about today, although we can't get into all of these, is to discuss a little bit about the thickness and how much that matters. And so when we look at how thick people wear their sunscreens, for starters, this graph is a really interesting graph. And the first thing I'd like to start off by saying is that the FDA asks all sunscreen companies to measure their sunscreens by using the dose of 2 milligrams per centimeter squared. So if you have a centimeter, picture you have a circle, and the diameter of that circle is 1 centimeter. Basically, you have to put 2 milligrams into that 1 centimeter, and that's how thick your sunscreen has to be. Now, if any of you have actually put on sunscreen, that's actually pretty thick. And there's been study after study after study, and you can see in this graph right here that most people, when they calculate how much sunscreen they put on, it's usually between 0.5 milligrams, which is 1/4 of what the FDA tests at, to about 1 milligram per centimeter squared, which is at half of what the FDA tests at. And this isn't just because people don't know how to wear sunscreens. In fact, they did some of this testing on people that have skin conditions where they're very sensitive to sunlight, and they also tested it on dermatologists. And it turns out that even they wore their sunscreen at about 1 milligram per centimeter squared. So that's why it's really important that when you put on that first coat, you want to make sure that you wait the 10 minutes and put on that second coat, so that you're getting the full thickness that the testing is done at. And why is that important? Well, if we go to the next slide, you'll see that one of the things about the FDA guidelines, like I had mentioned, is that the testing is done at 2 milligrams per centimeter squared. But in the real world, it's between 0.5 to 1 milligram centimeter squared, as I just mentioned. So what's really important, and if we just click on the slide, one of the things that's really important is that the SPF on the label is not necessarily accurate. And what I mean is, if you have an SPF 30 sunscreen, if you don't put it on at 2 milligrams per centimeter squared, you're going to get less than SPF 30 protection. Now that's probably okay, but you have to just realize how much less protection are you truly getting. So on the next slide, I'm showing what kind of protection you actually get. So on the very left column, what you'll see is what would be the SPFs that are labeled on these sunscreens. Now remember, SPF 100 is going to be something that's not going to exist anymore, because the new guidelines are that it has to be SPF 50 and 50 plus. But just for sake of example, if you look at this, if your SPF has a 15, for example, or let's go to the SPF 30 since that's the recommended amount. If you have an SPF of 30 and you put it on at 1 milligram per centimeter squared, which is the normal dose that a lot of people put it on, your SPF is going to be about 6 to 15, depending on how thick you put it on. And if you're of the group that doesn't like to put on sunscreen too thick, and you put it on at 1/4 the thickness, your SPF drops anywhere from about 2 to 8. And so it's really important to realize that the SPF factor that you're getting is probably much less than you think. And even if you go up to say SPF 50, you can see that if you put it on thin, again, looking at the row that has SPF 50 and you look all the way to the right, your SPF is going to be 3 to about 13. Why is this important? Well, it turns out you don't need that much SPF to prevent a burn. So what I'm showing here doesn't mean that sunscreens should not be used. They should absolutely be used because they still provide SPF, and that's very important. But your SPF is probably not as high as you think it is. And so you want to be diligent about reapplying your sunscreen. And so that's why we tell people to apply the sunscreen, apply again in 15 minutes, because that's so that, you know, all that sunscreen that settles, you can account for that by putting on a nice second coat. And then you should reapply again anytime you go into the water and come out, or if you're sweating, or if you're running, you want to be sure you try to reapply. And what we tell people as a rule of thumb is to reapply in 2 hours. And so that's a little bit of a background and a review on sunscreens. We're going to get into much more details. How do you pick the ingredients? What do the ingredients mean? What are some tips and tricks on how you apply the sunscreen? How do you differentiate between spray sunscreens and cream sunscreens? It'll be a really fun webinar, but I wanted to give a little bit of an introduction about sunscreens today. So the next topic that I wanted to talk about was protective clothing. Sunscreens are important, but clothing is probably the most important way that you can protect yourself. And clothing isn't just clothing. It's really important to think about, there's different kinds of clothing that you could wear. And it's important to think about what kind of clothing you're gonna wear or you're gonna put on your child when they're outdoors, because it's been shown that sunburns that occur earlier in life end up being more dangerous because they can lead to more mutations. And so if you have your child playing outdoors, or you have a family member, or even yourself, it's important to know that your clothing is only as good as the ability of the cloth to prevent sunlight from getting through it. And so what I mean here is I show you 2 different examples of clothing, and you can see here on the left, this cloth, when it's been zoomed in on, has much larger spaces in between the fibers. Whereas if you look at the cloth on the right, it's a tighter weave. And so it turns out that if you use clothing that has a looser weave, then sunlight can get through that much more easily than if it's got a tighter weave to it. And where this can become really relevant is when you think about, for example, cotton t-shirts. If you got a newly minted cotton t-shirt and you're really excited about taking that out on the beach, and you want to throw it on, or you want to put it on your child while, you know, they're going to be out on the beach, and you want to get them really protected, it's better to pre-wash your clothes, because that cotton will shrink after you wash it, and that shrink will tighten up that weave, and that will offer better protection. And you know, there have been studies that even have looked at things like color. And so on the next slide, we get into, what we'll do is we'll get into all the nuances of sun protective clothing. So the first thing that you want to think about is color. What color is it? So it turns out that white, although you can stay cooler in white, it lets in a lot more sunlight than, say, black. And so there have been studies that have looked at white versus blue versus black, and we'll review some of those studies, and we'll get into the details on why color would be important. And then I talk about the 4 W's. So the next one is weight. How much material is being used to make that t-shirt? They're different kind of t-shirts. Some t-shirts have what's known as a larger gauge, and other ones have a smaller gauge, meaning they use more material to make that t-shirt. And the more material that you have, the more the sunlight has to try to get through before it can get to your skin. The next W that I like to talk about is weave. And we just alluded to that in the previous slide. How tightly knit is it? The tighter the knitting, the more protective it is. And it turns out that there are these special clothing lines that are rated for ultraviolet protective factor, UPF clothing. And in those cases, those clothes are knit at a very tight weave so that sunlight is not able to get through as well. And that's how they can get different ultraviolet protective factors into their clothes. The next W is wash. Has it been washed? Again, cotton especially is notorious for being a larger weave, and once you wash it, and especially that dryer, putting it through the dryer and the drying process helps shrink that cotton. So my suggestion to a lot of my patients, especially when they ask about how do I wear sun protective clothing, you know, I'm taking my child out, we're gonna be spending the day at an amusement park, or we're gonna go out to the beach. I tell them pre-wash the clothing because that's gonna really tighten that knitting. And in fact, I tell them don't put them in white clothes. Give them a color that's away from white, because it turns out that when you start to, and this is the final W, when you start to wet the clothes with water, say they're at the beach or if they're in the pool and you have a shirt over them, it turns out when you wet clothing, the color matters again. And so white t-shirts, for example, allow a lot more light to pass through than a black t-shirt. And so you have to balance. Sometimes black might not be comfortable to wear because it gets very hot. And so I tell people to pick something in between, something that's like a green or a blue, or perhaps something that's a little bit more darker in the red, but maybe not too dark so it doesn't get too warm. But the whole idea being, you don't want to just look at white as being cooling, because in the end, you might actually end up letting more light through, especially if they're going to get into the water or they're going to be getting that shirt wet. So those are some of the topics that we're going to talk about in terms of practical tips for selecting clothing. And of course, it's not always possible to have sunscreen on all the time. And so I always tell people, if you can get clothing on your children, that really makes a big difference. Or wear the right clothing. If you're snorkeling, you know, you don't realize how much light's hitting your back. Wearing the right kind of clothing if you're out on a vacation in the water, especially with the summertime coming, that can make a large difference for how protected you stay. And the last topic that I wanted to talk about, and we'll just briefly do an overview here, is tanning. And you know, tanning is something that when you really think about tanning, it's something that's so widely prevalent, and it's become a part of the American and the Western culture to tan, and this whole notion that being more tan is more beautiful. Well, you know, as dermatologists, we try to tell people that tan skin is damaged skin, but at the same time, you know, we do realize that there is this whole push that tanning also seems to come across as being healthier and being more glowing. And so, you know, I've tried to think about how do we approach this, because the more you tan, the truth is, the more you are depleting your skin of its natural antioxidants, and also the more you are damaging it. So here are some of the things just to think about when you think about tanning. And, you know, the skin's natural antioxidants are really important, and they're there to try to protect your skin. And we're going to go into details about this, but we'll talk about what do you already have. Your body naturally makes vitamin E. Your body naturally has vitamin C. How quickly do you deplete your antioxidants? You might not realize this, but even before you sunburn, even before you turn red, you are depleting your natural antioxidants. And I'll show some of the data that might be very surprising. That shows that even when you're starting to get close to turning red, you've depleted quite a large amount of the antioxidants that are naturally in your skin. You can deplete them up to about 60 to 70%. And so we can talk about what are some topicals and supplements that you can use to boost your antioxidants. But, you know, getting back to this notion of tanning, I also like to talk about what are some alternate ways that you can approach tanning. And one of the things, and that's on the next slide. And so one of the things that you want to think about when you start thinking about alternate ways of tanning is, what are safer ways to tan, especially if you do want that darker look? Well, you have spray tanning, and we'll go over the science of spray tanning and how that works. And then there's two other kinds of tanning that I like to talk to people about. There's something called shade tanning. Not that I promote tanning, but at the same time, when you're sitting in the shade, you might not realize, especially on the beach, or if you're under a pool umbrella, there's a lot of sunlight that's reflected from the water, reflected from the sand, that's still gonna find its way under your umbrella. Even if you wear your sunscreen, some of that ultraviolet A light, now ultraviolet A is what can bounce and reflect much more easily, and it's what leads to tanning. It's gonna help get you tanned without having that direct sunlight. So you can stay safe, but you can still get a tan. And the kind of tanning that I think is really healthy is exercise tanning. And what I mean by this is, even if you go for a nice jog in the morning or in the evening, there's enough ultraviolet A light that's in the atmosphere that you're gonna get tanned. If you're a biker, or if you're a jogger, a runner, any sort of sport that you're doing, you're still going to end up getting a tan. But why not do it in a way that's fun and good for your body as well? And so we'll talk about exercise tanning, the whole notion that there's always some ultraviolet light, even if you're not going to burn, you have ultraviolet A, which still can lead to a tan. So all in all, my hope is that with our webinar, we'll get into some really fun topics. I gave you a little snapshot of some of these things, but the idea being sunscreens are important, but they've got to be used in the context of greater sun protection habits, such as using sun protective clothing and being really smart about how you expose yourself when you're going to be playing in the sun. Botanicals have promising properties for dermatology, so we'll talk about some of the oral supplements that people can use, and some of the topicals that may actually help boost the antioxidant properties of your skin. And remember, this is also another chance to eat right, eat smart, and eat for sun safety and for healthy skin. And so with that, I'd like to invite everyone to join us for our next class. And this is part 2, but this is where we're really going to get into a lot more of the details. You'll see that class is a little bit longer. We go from 5:30 to 7, and we'll delve into all the details so that you can get sun ready and get your skin as healthy as possible for the summer. And with that, I would like to invite any questions from any of you, and look forward to both this webinar and any questions that you have.
Great, thank you, Raja, for that wonderful presentation. Extremely informative. And I apologize, every once in a while I do get some feedback on my side of the screen, so I hope it's not too terrible. So we did get in a few questions, and we will be sharing out a recording of this, so if you think of any additional questions, you can always reply to that email. The goal of this webinar really is to kind of give you an overview, to give you more information about what that webinar plans to cover in June, but also to take in any additional questions so that we can really answer what would be relevant for you all to hear about as we delve deeper. So one of the first questions we have is regarding the number rating used for hats. So is there something, you mentioned clothing, is there also a rating system for hats?
Yeah, you know, the rating system, this is a great question, because hats, let me start by saying that hats are such a wonderful way to protect from sunlight, because one of the things that people forget to do when they put on sunscreen is it's hard to get it, especially if you have thinning hair, for starters, for men. And, you know, for women that are a little older, their hair starts to thin as well. You want, you know, what people don't realize is you do get quite a bit of sun exposure onto the scalp. And then secondly, your ears. Your ears get a lot of sunlight, and a lot of people forget to put sunscreen on their ears. And unfortunately, we do see skin cancers developing on the ears. And the problem with skin cancers there is that we have no choice, but really got to cut the ear. You know, we have to cut that portion out. There's not a lot of skin that moves and that can be stitched very easily. But to get back to the question, in regards to the rating system for hats, many of them will use a rating system that's also based very similar to, a lot of these rating systems are based similar to how the sunscreens work. Basically, they look at how easily can sunlight penetrate through and cause the skin to turn red, and how much better is it with the hat versus without the hat. And usually it's all related to the cloth and the weave that's used on the hat. So many times you'll have hats that are rated through what's known as the UPF system, ultraviolet protection factor system. And a lot of these companies that sell sun protective clothing will have not only hats rated, but their shirts rated and different sun clothing, different clothing items rated in a similar manner.
Great. And our next question is regarding whether or not one needs to wear sunscreen or protective clothing in the morning or the evening when the sun may be out but not as strong.
So one of the things about sun exposure during the day is during the middle of the day, when sunlight is most intense, and we usually say that's from 10 to about 2 or 3 o'clock, when you have direct sunlight, you get a lot more ultraviolet B radiation, and that's the one that leads to sunburns. But at the same time, if you're in the morning time and the sun's already risen, what ends up happening is you get a lot of the ultraviolet light that tends to bend, and ultraviolet A and reflect. And ultraviolet A scatters more easily, especially on cloudy days or in the early morning or later in the evening. And ultraviolet A, while it might not burn you as easily, different people have different sensitivities. So things like melasma, dark spots on the face, any sort of collagen breakdown, that still happens from ultraviolet A. So it's still important to wear sunscreens and sun protective clothing in the morning and the evening when the sun's out. And even though it's not as strong, meaning that you might not be getting as much direct ultraviolet B, you're still going to get ultraviolet A. And so there's still going to be changes in the skin that you want to protect from in those times.
Thank you. And our next question, what about vitamin D? So oftentimes people think about being out in the sun as a way to get enough vitamin D. Is that always the case?
This is such a great question. I'm so happy that this was brought up, and we'll go into more detail. So vitamin D is very important. It's very important for our health, and it's very important for having strong bones, and actually for many different things. They're showing now that if people become deficient in vitamin D, there's a higher risk for certain cancers to develop. Luckily, we can get vitamin D from a variety of sources. So sunlight clearly is one of the ways that our skin is able to produce the vitamin D, and that's very important. We can also get it from supplements, and there are quite a few supplements that are good. There's vitamin D3, vitamin D2. Turns out D3 is more effective than D2. So if you have a choice between the two supplements, several studies have shown that D3 is the better way to supplement if you want to get your vitamin D. So you don't have to only get it from sunlight. On the other hand, when you're thinking about vitamin D, it's ultraviolet B, and it's a funny little jingle that I have. I said B for burn. Well, ultraviolet B causes vitamin D. That's the way I remember that as well. So ultraviolet B is important for vitamin D. So if you're going to a tanning booth, for example, and trying to get vitamin D from there, you're getting ultraviolet A, and so you're not going to get that much vitamin D. And so you want to be careful about going to a tanning booth and thinking about vitamin D from a tanning booth. You're not going to be able to do that. But I do realize that vitamin D is important. So what we tell people to do is, if your skin is, especially for those that are very sensitive to sunlight, please supplement. There are very good supplements out there that can help make sure that you get the right amount of vitamin D for you.
Thank you. And then our final question for the evening is, how important is the weather report of UV index?
UV index is an important rating system that's used frequently to serve as a measure for how much ultraviolet light is, how intense is the ultraviolet light in the area that you're in. So, you'll see these, and these are very easy to look up. You can look up the UV index for a geographic area or your neighborhood. Many times it'll be in the greater city area. So, and it's very important because it gives you a snapshot of how intense is the ultraviolet light. And that's a reflection of both ultraviolet A and especially ultraviolet B. How quickly are you going to burn? And there's different zones. So there's a safer zone, there's a mid zone, and then a danger zone. The danger zone is important because it does not take much to burn, especially when you have a high UV index. I'm speaking in the Sacramento area, and Sacramento can get quite hot in the summertime. And when you have UV indexes that are up into 7s and 8s and 9s and 10s, it's important to realize that that means it's more intense sunlight, and you want to be really cautious about, especially if you have children or if you're going to go out and spend time on the water, about how you're going to protect yourself, more so than if there was a lower UV index. And what UV index basically means is that at a higher UV index, it takes less time to burn. So because it's much more intense. And they now have personal monitors that people can wear that can tell you what the UV index is, how much UV have you accumulated on your skin. I mean, it seems like technology can do a lot of very cool things. And there are a few technological gadgets out there now that can really help you think about what UV exposure am I getting, and how much of a dose am I getting, so that you can be very mindful of how close you are to burning or how much UV you're getting. But UV index is very important.
Well, thank you. And thank you everyone for attending tonight's webinar. Hopefully now you've had a good chance to preview what the full webinar will be covering. And again, if there are any topics or questions that came up today that weren't covered or that you were more curious about, feel free to email us. We will be curating a list of these questions to be sure that we cover them in the next webinar in June. And so 2 takeaways following this evening that we hope you will do. The first is to go to dermveda.com. It is a free resource and a free website, all focused on integrative skincare. And so we cover a variety of topics. Our first webinar this summer, spring, is on sun protection, but we will also be getting into disease-specific topics such as eczema, acne. So we cover a wide variety of topics, all focused on skin, taking an integrative approach from the inside out. And so if you go to dermveda.com, you can answer a free skin quiz that will help you create a profile. And from there, you can find content that's matched to your skin type. And so we hope you'll check that out and let us know how you find that valuable. And then the second thing we would love is for you to share our June webinar with your network. So we will be offering a follow-on to tonight's webinar next month on the 20th, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you all for joining us this evening.